The great thing about graphite is that it's incredibly easy to blend to get smooth transitions and gradients in drawing. In this video, we're going to discuss the three major ways to blend graphite using a tissue, a blending stump, and hatching or cross-hatching. As you can see in these three spheres, each technique gives you a slightly different texture. The purpose of blending graphite is to give us a transition from a darker value to a lighter value. From a distance, texture doesn't add that much value to a drawing. As you could see, if I blur these three spheres, each one looks very similar. But as a viewer gets closer to a drawing, the differences become much more apparent. A high quality paper will make blending graphite so much easier, so I recommend purchasing a cotton or rag paper such as Arch Hot Pressed. Any brand of graphite pencils will work fine for this. I'm using Caran d'Ache Graphwood from 4H up to 4B. I'll also be using a stick eraser. This is one made by Tombow. There's a bunch of brands and they all seem to work similar to me. And the last thing we're going to need are blending tools, so I'm using blending stumps and normal household tissues. An important part of drawing that's often overlooked is keeping our paper clean. So what I like to do is draw some lines and mask off the edges of my paper. And while I'm drawing, I keep a scrap piece of paper under my right hand so that I don't smear the graphite. I'm using a template to draw 3 circles, all of which are the same size for the different textures. This first sphere is going to be our smooth texture. So what I'm doing is starting with my lightest pencil. Here I'm using a 4H. You can start with a lighter pencil if you'd like a 5H or 6H, but in my experience, I've noticed that a 4H is usually light enough. You'll see as I lay this down, it's barely going to be visible, especially when I start blending it with the tissue. Since we want this as smooth as possible, what I'm doing is laying down the graphite in horizontal strokes that are parallel to each other. I'm doing the best I can to try to apply the exact same pressure the whole way through. Something important here is you don't have to worry about staying inside the lines. You could scribble right outside them and then erase it later. It's not a problem, because it's hard to keep the pressure even if you have to color in a very small area. It's a lot easier if you're using the same motion, not having to stop and start in different locations. So once we have a light, even layer of graphite down, I'm going to take a normal tissue. This is a normal household tissue like a Kleenex, and wrap it around my pointer finger. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on one section and slowly press into the graphite using circular motions to blend it smooth. Like I said before, don't worry about going outside the lines. You can always clean that up later with an eraser. When you use a tissue to blend, you'll also notice that the graphite tends to lighten a bit. This is because the tissue picks up some of the graphite on itself, so it almost acts like a very subtle eraser, knocking down the value so it's very light. There's times in drawing where you'll need a flat area filled in one value, so this is the best way to do it. If you start with a light pencil like a 4H or even a 2H, fill in the area as even as you can with horizontal strokes of the same pressure, and then blend it smooth with the tissue. You'll get a very even surface, maybe for example like a wall behind someone where you don't want any texture on it, but you want it a little bit darker than the paper itself. This is the best way to go about it. I want this to look like a sphere rather than a circle filled in, so I'm going to have to add values around the edges to darken them so they look farther away, and the bright center is going to look closer to us. So what I'm doing is I'm moving up into darker values. I'm going into a 2H, filling it in, blending it with the tissue, then using an HB like I did right here, filled it in, and then I'm going to use a 2B on the edges. Same exact thing as I did with the 4H in the beginning. Very lightly fill in some graphite around the edges, and then start on the outside with my tissue and blend into the center, so we get a very smooth transition. Remember, when you blend with the tissue, the values are going to lighten slightly, so you may have to go back with your pencil again and darken in some areas. So as you can see with this technique, we get a very smooth surface. Now, our next technique, we're going to add some texture to it. So I'm going to draw in small circular motions and then use a blending stump to blend these out. So just like before, I'm starting with my lightest pencil here, which is a 4H. Now, as you can see, I'm holding the pencil toward the middle, not the very back this time. This gives me a little bit more control to draw these small circular motions. And as you can see, I'm just working in one section, slowly but working my way to the next. I'm not rushing, and I'm not trying to fill in the whole circle. I find this technique absolutely amazing for anything organic. It works wonderful for skin textures if you're trying to get subtle imperfections in the skin or make a texture look like there's some pores. It also works great on things like lemon peels, or if you're drawing a fruit, maybe an apple or a pear, to get that slightly bumpy texture that we see on the skin of fruit. You can also use this technique for an area that's flat, one value that you don't want to be perfectly smooth. Maybe it has a slight texture to it, because if you fill in a large area with this from a distance, it'll almost look like an even value across the whole thing. It won't be as smooth as the first one, but it's just another technique that you could use if needed. Another thing I'd like to point out is that the paper you use is going to play a large role in the amount of texture that you have in your drawing. So this one here is a hot pressed cotton based paper, which is smooth, but it's not perfectly smooth. If you rub your fingers on the paper, you'll notice there's a very subtle texture. And you could see in my left drawing where I blended it smooth with a tissue that there are still some bumps in it, and that's good. It helps to hold the graphite in. And if you switch to a rougher paper called either a cold pressed, or sometimes it's marketed as rough pressed, you have a very strong texture to it that has deep ridges in it, and it's going to show on the drawing. It could be useful if you want that in your drawing. I know some artists really like it, but that's mainly used for watercolor painting, where you want something to kind of grab and hold the pigment. So it's not really used for drawing. Any sort of drawing paper is generally good. It's pretty smooth, but I find it a little bit more difficult to blend on. This cotton-based paper, basically any brand of cotton or rag paper, hot pressed, seems to be the best for blending, just in my opinion. Now, blending with a blending stump is very simple. You just hold it like a normal pencil, and the way I blend here is small circular motions, just like we did with the pencil. The only thing here is I can press a little bit harder on this because it's very soft, unlike a pencil. So as you press with this, you're going to notice that the graphite gets a little bit darker because you're pushing it in to the paper itself, unlike the tissue method where it seems to get a little bit lighter. So just realize when you put down graphite and you intend to blend it with a blending stump, that it's going to darken a little bit. So it's always best to keep your drawing a little bit lighter before you blend. This method doesn't lift up the graphite the way a tissue does. A tissue is almost like an eraser. If you look at your finger after you finish blending with the tissue, you'll notice a lot of the graphite lifted up. That's why it looks lighter. When you press with a blending stump, it really stays on the page and gets kind of pushed into the fibers of the paper a little bit more. The only trick to get this smooth and to look nice is just to work slowly. Remember, a pencil is just a tiny point on a page, unlike a paintbrush where you could switch to larger sizes and fill in an area. A pencil, you just have this tiny little point. So if you want to fill in a large area and make the values relatively even, you have to work slowly. There's no way around that. So a tissue could work for larger areas, but it's going to give you a soft texture. And a blending stump can work. It's mainly used for smaller areas, but if you want to use it for larger areas, you can too. You just have to work slow and understand that you're going to get more of a texture. Just like before, I started with a light value and I'm working my way up to darker values. Here I'm using a 2H, an HB, and a 2B to fill these in a little bit darker. And after each value, I come in with a blending stump, and exactly like before, I use small circular motions to blend it. If I want an area a little bit darker, I press harder on the blending stump. If I want it a little bit lighter, I just use less pressure. The last part to add texture is blending with an eraser. So you're not actually blending the pigment like you are with a blending stump. What you're doing is you're removing it. So you want to start in the brightest area, and just like the blending stump, you erase with small circular motions. And as you go out to an area that you want a little bit darker, you use less pressure. And you slowly build this from your lightest area to your darker area, and you'll get a transition from light to dark. And this is such a simple, easy way to add skin texture. Anybody can do this, and you can create amazing portraits just by working slowly and trying to keep that circular motion small and even across the whole drawing. And last but not least is hatching or cross-hatching. In this style, we're not actually blending the graphite. This is often used in pen or ink drawings. For hatching, what I'm doing is adding the graphite in strokes which are parallel to each other, and I'm laying them down as evenly as possible. Each stroke is next to the last one, so you get a whole bunch of lines lined up. Then if we want to darken it, we can just add more lines or add the lines perpendicular. That's going to add more graphite to the paper, and it's going to make it appear darker. You could hold the pencil any way you'd like for this. I generally like to hold it from the back because it gives me a little bit more control over the pressure. But as you can see here, I'm laying down lines all parallel to each other. And then when I want it a little bit darker, I add the lines perpendicular. So that's called cross hatching. As I said before, this is one of the best ways to blend ink or markers or pens, something where the medium doesn't move around as easily as graphite. This technique is also used by many painters or plein air painters who are looking to place values in blocks or planes in large areas. This way you can get down values quickly and accurately without having to worry about taking another brush or another tool to blend them. Now let's take a look at a few of these techniques used in an actual drawing. This is a drawing I did of my brother a few years ago back in graduate school. If we look at the back on this wall here, this flat area was all blended with the first technique using a tissue. This way you get soft, even values across the whole thing. The tissue technique would be a bit too smooth for skin textures, so if we zoom into the hand here, we can see that I used the blending stump for parts of the hand here, especially in this shadow, just to add some more texture to break up the uniformity of the value. And for the last technique of hatching, I used some on the collar here just to add some of that decorative pattern, and I also added some on this blanket on the right side to give some of that fuzzy appearance of this type of blanket. So that's going to be it for this video. If you're new to drawing and you're learning different ways to add graphite to the page, try these different techniques and see which one works best for you. Just remember that there's no one way to draw. Just make sure while you're working on it, you're having fun and enjoying the process. So thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.